Okay, so this is a little Nomad book club discussion, and our theme for this month is Costa Rica, and I am speaking to Dr. Natasha Gordon-Chipembere, who has written a beautiful novel called Finding La Negrita. Um, and I'll let you, Natasha, introduce the book, kind of what's it about, and uh, yeah.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me on. I am really excited to speak to folks about Costa Rica. I'm an Afro-Costa Rican slash Panamanian because my mom's from Costa Rica. So I'm third generation Costa Rican and my dad's from Panama, but I was born in New York and moved back to Costa Rica 12 years ago with my husband and two children. So this is where I am based. And one of the things that I really wanted to do originally was I wanted to write a book about slavery in Costa Rica. And a lot of it came out of a conversation that I had with my mother, and she went to the University of Costa Rica and she basically was like, there was no slavery in Costa Rica. And I was just like, highly unlikely,
Yeah.
knowing the whole region. And so I started to dig in. I started to, I came to Costa Rica and I did some archival work. I'm a scholar of African diasporic literature. And so this is kind of things that I do. And originally, I was just going to write a history book on slavery and found out that, Costa Rica had over 200 years of slavery, right? They didn't have a slave port. The closest one was in Portobelo, Panama, but, there was a presence of Afro-descended folks who were either enslaved in other places in Latin America and brought into Costa Rica, or as we know now, there were 650 survivors of two Danish slave ships that crashed in March 1710 on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, and those survivors essentially blended into the bloodstream of, I guess, the indigenous folks who are from Talamanca. And so you have a large Afro-Indigenous population still in that region on the Caribbean coast. So you have multiple presence of Afro descendants. But originally, as I said, I thought I was just going to write a history book on slavery in Costa Rica. And going through the archives, even though I found really rich data documenting, the early Costa Ricans or the Spaniard colonists who were in Cartago, which was the colonial capital, I found documentation of these, important families that owned enslaved people. But I also found documentation of a community of free Black people who lived and worked in Cartago, and it was called La Puebla de los Pardos, or before that, La Gotera. And it was essentially a township that was really adjacent to Cartago, and people came back and forth every day and worked in Cartago, the city center, but then there was essentially a curfew where they had to go back into this Black township. And I wanted to write about, who no one knew that during this colonial time period that there was actually a group of free people that were not maroons. They were not living in hiding. They were engaging with civic life in Costa Rica and essentially creating the nation, right? And so I thought about, as a scholar and someone thinking about, archival work, but also creative work, um, historian Saidiya Hartman has this theory called critical fabulation, which is where you basically take the facts from the archive and then infuse sort of your creativity to fill in the gaps. And obviously, with slavery, there's a lot of filling in the gaps, right? We get a lot of statistics. We don't get, maybe we get a couple of names, listings from families of how many enslaved people they had, but we don't get their lives. We don't get their stories. And particularly thinking about something different, a whole free Black community. And so that's what my book is about. Finding La Negrita, it's really about this free Black community and how they had to struggle with freedom. Freedom was very tenuous at that time. And also thinking about the Black Madonna, right? So the Black Madonna is Costa Rica's patron saint, but she here is called in Costa Rica, La Negrita, the little Black one, right? And I mean, obviously in church narrative, she's been whitened and she's been called La Virgen de los Angeles, right? And she's in the Basilica, but she's considered one of the 450 Black Madonnas in the world that is highly venerated. August 2nd is her official veneration date in Costa Rica. And essentially, the country closes down. People walk on pilgrimages to her, and people really understand her as the Black Madonna. And so, one of the things I wanted to do was not only write about this free Black community, but think about their relationship with this Black Madonna and thinking about it from an Africanist perspective. And so that's what I did. That's what this book is, finding La Negrita, finding, the journey towards finding this Black Madonna. But also, if I could just show the cover, so the cover is from a mural by a Costa Rican artist, Guadalupe Alvaro Rojas, and she did this mural that is in the Municipal Museum in Cartago, and you can go and visit. It's free, you can go in, but she did a mural that basically documents the historical and colonial history of Costa Rica. And so when I first landed here 12 years ago, I had a friend who took me on a tour of Cartago because I was in the beginning process of researching this book. And she took me to the museum, and this image, I mean, it struck me, and I didn't actually realize that what I had done was really internalize this visual narrative of this book, right? Here's La Negrita, but here's this angel, and then here's the mother and the baby, and then you have the church behind, but you have this angel here, right? And obviously these enslaved people. And I did not realize how deeply infused this visual narrative had sunk into my consciousness. So I wrote this entire book, and essentially I wrote the story of the image, and I didn't realize it. And it was so interesting because when my book was acquired by Jaded Ibis Press, which is a small feminist press in California, we were discussing a book cover, and this is like 5 years later, right? And after seeing this image, and I had gone with another cover. I was thinking about another cover. So I went to my husband. I said, I want you to look at this image. What do you think about it? He was like, absolutely not. He was like, your image is from the mural. And I was like, what mural? I had no recollection of it. And he was like, honey, the mural, that is your image. Go back to it. And I had to pull out my old BlackBerry that I had taken pictures. I was like, I don't even have a charger for this thing. But on the BlackBerry were these pictures from the mural. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is my image for the book. And this is the story. I never put them together until my husband said, don't you remember? And my sister's a professional photographer. I brought her in from New York, got her permission from the artist to use the image for the book. She was so generous. My sister came in and she took professional photos, sent it to the press, and now here you have this narrative that I internalized. So the way that visual art inspired my story is so profound, and it directly has like another part of the mural is what I'm hoping to use for my next book, because I'm writing a trilogy on Afro-Costa Rican. So I'm actually in the middle of writing 1710, which is the story of the two Danish ships that crashed on Cauita, and writing that story right now.
Oh my goodness. That is so interesting. I had some questions lined up, and now I feel like you've answered some of them, but also the way they've come together. I think the way that you've described it as well, of like how the narrative developed, and your original intentions that were for writing a more academic piece of text, and how you've given a more fuller humanity to this story by creating a novel, which also makes it more accessible to people like me that might not be as academically minded. And then to hear as well, what I really loved was the start of the book has this introduction that is about your story of going to Cartago and seeing La Negrita and being inspired as well. And then to hear on top of that, there is this other layer that is the mural. And it's almost like a framing narrative of the story, like your own personal story of how you came to create this book and these characters, that I find really really interesting. I love it when life imitates art, and
Yeah.
you know, the inspiration behind it is also your story as well. And that's so, you know, when the universe is like conspiring to meet you and
Yeah.
everything has come together. And that was going to be my question of I understand the academic intentions there. And then once you had the idea of I want to tell the story of this time and this place, how the characters came to you. So are you saying like they're you can pick out the exact characters from the mural, or were these characters that you thought of consciously, I want someone to represent this, or were they people that came organically to you and you were like, oh, this person is this and must live in the story this way?
Well, they just came to me. So I would say Dakarai was the first character that came to me. I absolutely, he just showed up. I knew that he wanted to tell a story. And I never thought, like, okay, can I be in the voice of a man? Or like, that never, it was never a question for me. Once I decided that I was going to sort of be the medium through which these characters were going to unfold. Um, that was very clear to me. The other thing is that I was very intentional about wanting to have a very beautiful and complex and flawed African man as part of the story, right? Because one, as someone who has, been in the classroom teaching African diasporic literature for over 30 years, he's not there very often. And I think back to my inspiration, which is The Farming of Bones by Edwidge Dandicat, who's a Haitian American writer whose work I love, and particularly that's a historical fiction sort of narrative or retelling of the Haitian massacre of 1937 in the Dominican Republic. But her main character is in love with this man who's a cane cutter from Haiti. And, he is so complex, but he's so tender. And I love the way that Dandy Cat generally writes about men. And in some ways, these men are not foreign to me. I have men in my life, my father, my husband, my cousins, who are these beautiful, loving, complex men who are absolutely present, right? So I think that there's this narrative of sort of the missing Black man in so many stories, the absent father. And that's not my reality. My reality is, my husband's an incredible father. I mean, my father is an incredible father. My uncle was an incredible uncle. I have all these beautiful men in my family, and I really wanted to write about that complexity and understand that there are other narratives, particularly of Black men, based on my own personal experience, right? And so I wanted to have that. And then I wanted to have some intergenerational complexity as well. So I have the father-daughter with Jendai, who has to come of age and figure things out for herself because she's a motherless child. But I also didn't want her mother just to sort of be this person who perished on the slave ship, but I wanted her to have a voice and a presence as an ancestor throughout. And then obviously I wanted to bring in the complexity of slavery. So the love interest for Dakarai, who is a free Pardo who lives in Puebla de los Pardos, is in love with Michaela, and she is an enslaved woman, right? And has to make certain choices around her body, her safety, her freedom, or her lack of freedom. And Esmeralda. Esmeralda is our narrator. She is able to see everything, and she's disabled. So she's blind in one eye. She's been burned because she's been abused, but she also has the ability to read and write, right, as an enslaved person. So she's incredibly dangerous, and at least to the colonist, right? But she is someone who is invisible to them, but highly visible and valued in the community, as someone who's a mediator, who's someone who can, because she can read and write, she can read and alert folks to what's coming down the road for them in order to protect them. And I really wanted to make sure that even though physically she's disabled, she's incredibly powerful, and someone who's abused, but she's incredibly powerful. That's really, really, really important to me. And so these characters kind of just showed up. And the main theme for my book that I wanted to really flesh out was this idea of love. and love in the time of oppression, right? So love for me is the most radical and revolutionary thing you can do and be inside of and feel. This action verb, this process, even in the face of being enslaved. And so that's what I wanted each of the characters to feel, to struggle through, to process. And then love, and I guess the mirror of love is this idea of freedom in the moment of slavery.
I love that. I feel like that really hits the nail on the head of like what I loved about your characters was this idea of complexity. And what I love about how you reveal that complexity is that you're introduced to these characters, but then several chapters later, you might find out something about them from their past that makes them the way that they are. And the pieces fit together, and you go, oh, now I understand why they acted that way. And you see they become more multi-dimensional. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about like creating a novel where you get like the full humanity of who these people were. They're not one-dimensional people. And that complexity also goes into this really interesting gray area sometimes between slavery and freedom, where you
Mhm.
have characters who are enslaved, you have characters who were enslaved and are now free, but how free are they exactly? Um, Two characters that really have stuck with me is like the relationship between Michaela and Lucia.
Oh yeah.
And I was just like, wait, what? Like, it's so jarring that the 1 minute you see how Lucia treats Michaela, and then next you learn something about their relationship as they grew up as children, or something that
Mhm.
Michaela did for Lucia or Lucia did for Michaela, where you're like, are they are they friends? Are they not? Like this power play of it's really stuck me, and I wanted to ask you like what is true freedom? And do you feel like any of the characters ever achieve it?
Hmm, that's a good question. Just before I answer that, I think the that what I was thinking about with Michaela and Lucia. So Michaela is enslaved, and she's sort of the personal, I don't know, lady's maid slave of Lucia. And Lucia is the daughter of the wealthiest widow, Spanish widow in town. And she's completely spoiled, but has her own traumas, right?
Yeah,
No spoilers. And
no spoilers.
so one of the things that was very particular to Costa Rican slavery was that there were three particular ways that enslaved people were sort of utilized during over that 200-year time period in the colonial time period. So you had men who were sent to Matina, which is on the Caribbean, to work in cacao plantations, and they were fairly autonomous in some ways, even though, once a year their owners would kind of come and visit the plantations. But at one point, during the colonial period, Costa Rica's currency was cacao. So these men were able to, in some ways, fashion a world of freedom for themselves and some autonomy. And they were also very intentional about marrying and having families with indigenous women because indigenous women could not be enslaved, right? And so their children were automatically born free. And so you have sort of that on the Caribbean coast. Now, obviously, chattel slavery, which is essentially, the mother, if you're enslaved, then your children will be enslaved through, eternity. That was happening in Costa Rica. And then you had, also enslaved men that were sent to Nicoya to cattle ranch. And that was, kind of what was happening. That was more in the Guanacaste area. So it was the northwest of the country. But the women were were kept in a domestic space. And so you have all these enslaved women working in the homes of Spaniards, and there's an intimacy that happens there, right? When you're there washing the clothes and you are taking care of personal needs, also you don't have the autonomy of your body. And so that's how, obviously a lot of enslaved women were raped and they produced children for their owners, but it was also the real intentional separation of Black families, right? right? So the men were far away, the women were in this space of surveillance all the time because they were in the homes. And I wanted to really play with that tension of, are you friends? You grew up together, but no, you're always a slave and always reminded of your place. And so I think that takes me back to the idea of freedom. I mean, for me, in some ways, Dakari and Jendai are free because what they've done is the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate act of love. In many cases, they're willing to release those in order to have the other people be free and not hold on to them, right? And so, I mean, I'm not going to go into the end of the book, but in many cases they have to make personal sacrifices around love and releasing in order for others to be free, and it's this concept. And I think it was Harriet Tubman basically said, until everybody else is free, I'm not free, even though she, became a free woman, but she constantly went back to, help other enslaved people gain their freedom through the Underground Railroad in the United States. And so it's that concept of until other people are free, even if I'm technically legally free, I'm not really free as a person of color, right? So my community has to be free. So I think I think in the end, and then obviously, and I don't think you've gotten to this part yet, I'm not sure, but Esmeralda also has the largest act of freedom. And that's all I'll say.
Um, yeah, I learned so much about Costa Rica's. Yeah, I think you write it in the introduction of like it's a unique form of slavery. Like we think of, I mean, certainly my education in the UK, we are taught the slave trade as in like Africa to the US,
Mhm.
and they mention the Caribbean a little bit. Never is it mentioned that the slaves in the Caribbean were owned by the British. Like, and
Yeah.
there's no real like detail into it or like how things were or like why they were the way that they were. And I feel like, yeah, I really learned a part of history that I didn't realize existed in this country and didn't realize existed in this way and was so unique to this
Mhm.
place. Um, so I really want to thank you for that. And my question is tied to that, and also that I feel like this novel is an act of communication of that story. And then within the novel, I feel like communication is a big theme, especially when it comes to language, the language of the colonial powers, those who can read and write, the languages that people of the different African diasporas can speak or not speak, the language of love, which seems to need no language. Um, and so it's a long-winded question, but as a tangent to that, obviously the novel is written in English. Was
Mhm.
that was that a choice? And for what choice was it to not have it in Spanish, or is it also translated in Spanish um, as well? Because I wanted to know where you think this book now sits in the canon of not just Costa Rican literature, but of Latin American literature and the literature of the African diaspora as well.
Mhm. Thank you for that. So it's not translated into Spanish as yet, because that's something that I would have to undertake financially by myself. My press wouldn't, doesn't, it's too small to actually fund a translation. Even though I do have a publisher in Costa Rica who would be interested in distributing it, but we're not there yet. And I do have a
Yeah,
translator, but translations are very, very expensive if you want to do it properly, right? I mean,
yeah,
a
of
translator
course.
would actually, the range starts at about 10,000, right? To translate a book, right? Yeah. And so you have to get a nice grant for that. And no, it can't be just run through Chat GPT or Google
Absolutely not.
Translate,
No.
and I would never sacrifice my work. It took 7 years for me to write this, right? And
Oh
research.
wow.
And so there's
Yeah.
no way. And I'm very clear about who I want to have it translated. So that's in the pipe at some point. But in terms of writing it in English, English is my first language. And I very intentionally wanted to write it in English, also because my own personal heritage with my parents, my mom and my grandmother being born in Limon on the Caribbean coast, but my great grandparents coming from Jamaica, they were English speakers, right? They were the people that the British owned. They're former British, subjects. And so, they spoke English. They were Anglicans, and they brought those traditions into Costa Rica. And the whole community in Limon basically spoke English. My mother eventually, because she had to go to school, spoke Spanish and English. My grandmother learned Spanish in her 50s, and my grandfather never
Oh,
spoke Spanish. As a Jamaican, he never spoke Spanish, and he didn't have to because in Limon, you could exist in an English speaking world. And so I also understood that that particular migration wasn't just to Costa Rica. It was happening simultaneously in Panama in terms of Anglophone Caribbean people coming to work on the Panama Canal, then going up, obviously, into Nicaragua and into Honduras. And I mean, so this whole Caribbean region, you have a large constant influx of English language speakers who then essentially become the body of Black Central Americans. And though there is obviously, a Creole that happens in all of these places, because there's Limonense Creole as well, there are English speakers. And so, people in my family are completely bilingual, right? They speak English and Spanish, they read English and Spanish, they write English and Spanish. And so for me, when I wrote this book, I was specifically thinking about marking a place in not only Black Central American thinking, but also in the wider Caribbean, and also in just thinking about Blackness outside in the diaspora outside of the United States, but thinking about it in Latin America. And I wanted this book to sort of kind of stand as a historical marker, as a place to begin to understand that, yes, many people don't know that there was 200 years of slavery in Costa Rica. Many people don't know there's a Black Madonna in Costa Rica, right? Many people don't know about this free Black community. A lot of people don't even know that Black people exist in Costa Rica, right? And if they do, they don't think about them in the colonial context, right? Like, folks were here right from the beginning with the Spaniards living alongside them. They think about them as sort of migrants in the 20th century who came to work for the United Fruit Company and the railroad, and sort of thinking about that. And so I really wanted to place a conversation that was already happening, I think, in Black Central America, that yes, there are Black people who have a historical legacy, who deeply informed the building of this country, and also had a relationship with the Black Madonna. And they existed, and that's really what I wanted to do. So it was very intentional. And English is my first language, so it's the language I feel most comfortable writing in. And I will continue to write my books in English, but I would love for them to be translated not only in Spanish but in other languages.
I love that, and I think it's evident even just in the title, Finding La Negrita, because it has the two languages in there as
Yeah.
well. I've my Zoom is telling me that we only have a short amount of time left, but I did want to ask you quickly to speak to
Sure.
the what you're working on now, because that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm doing a trilogy, right? So the first one was Finding La Negrita, to talk about the colonial time period and this free Black community and the Black Madonna. The second book is called 1710, and it's what I'm actively working on now. And it is the story from Denmark to Ghana to Costa Rica, 1708 to 1710, tracing these two slave ships from Denmark, from Copenhagen. And so I spent last summer in Copenhagen for 5 weeks in the archives. I had a Fulbright scholarship where I was just doing all this work. I worked with two maritime archaeologists who were the ones who came to Costa Rica to retrieve the I guess, samples from the ocean to take them back to Copenhagen to confirm that these two, that the bricks and the pipes and the wood were actually dated, because they knew about the missing ships, but they had never officially confirmed it. And I had also been working with a local Afro-Indigenous dive crew in Kawita. The problem is that because of maritime regulations, no one can extract anything from the ocean unless they have, like, they're certified maritime archaeologists, unless they basically have a doctorate. And so even though the local community knew about all of the things in the sea, they had been diving for a really long time, they could not extract anything to do any conservation whatsoever. And so you had two Danish scholars who came over. And so when I went to Denmark, I worked with them. I saw all the artifacts. And in April 2025, both governments officially announced that, yes, they confirmed that these were the two Danish slave ships that crashed in 1710. They were on the way to St. Thomas. 650 Africans survived, and then the Danish crew mutinied. They took all the gold, they basically burned the ships, and then they made it back to Denmark. So in Denmark, in the archives, you have all the testimonies from the crews, from the captains. I mean, you have everything there. It confirmed that they just needed to solidify the location. And so one of the things I found really interesting is that in Christiansborg Castle, which is in Accra, Ghana, that was the Danish sort of stronghold for their slave fort, essentially, and where they kept enslaved people to then send them out to the Caribbean, where St. Thomas, St. John, etc. But St. Thomas was their bigger, like, sugar plantations. That's where they took a lot of folks. And so one of the things that I was really interested in is that there was a tradition with the local Ga women in Accra, Ghana, who married these Danish men who worked and who came from Denmark and were part of the slave trade. And they worked as governors, they worked as different people in the fort, and these African women married these Danish men and had children with them. And sometimes these children were sent back to Copenhagen to get educated, and then when they got older, they were brought back to kind of run the fort, right, to participate in the enslavement of, yeah, I mean,
Wow.
so my main character is a product of a Ga mother and a Danish father, and so I'm exploring that story.
That sounds fascinating. I cannot wait to read that one next. I love this idea of the trilogy. What is the third that
Oh,
will
the
be in the
third one is
trilogy?
called Naomi, and it is a loose retelling of my great grandmother Ruth's story, migration from Jamaica to Costa Rica to Puerto Limon in 1908.
Oh my goodness. So that's a very personal story as well.
It's a very personal story. Yeah.
Oh my God. So thank you so much, Natasha, for speaking with me today. Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed finding La Negrita, and I encourage anyone listening to read the book. And yeah, please keep me updated on when the 1710, is that what it was called?
1710.
1710,
1710.
when it's published. I would love to read that too.
Thank you so much. And I hope that, if other folks have read the book and they have questions for me, please just follow me on Instagram and send me a question. It's just my name, Natasha Gordon Chipembere. And I'd love to answer any questions that folks have, if they've read the book from the book club.
Yeah, I'll send on that message as well. And yeah. Okay, I'll
Thank
stop
you.
the recording.